Okay, good morning. Welcome to Yongsan Baptist Church English Sunday School class for October 16th, 2022. It's great to have those here with us this morning and those that are watching online. We have made it through all 7 units of the biblical creationism study, and then I asked if there was anything that we might have not covered or missed, and someone suggested dinosaurs. The first point that I would say is I can't believe I skipped it when we were looking around at evidence from creation or looking down at evidence from geology. But we can probably cap this off in 2 to 3 lessons just as an alibi to talk about something that we left out. There is an aura of mystery surrounding the dinosaurs. Where did they come from? Did they evolve? Did they really live millions of years ago? What happened to them? Are there any living today? Has any human ever seen a live dinosaur? There are many books and movies that have been produced and published to try to answer these questions, or at least fantasize about the answers to these questions. The truth of the matter, however, is that there is no real mystery at all. Once you have key information that's not generally known and is widely withheld from the public, and you have the proper worldview perspective, you can see exactly what the truth is. In case you've never heard the biblical stance on dinosaurs, I'll give you the short version, and then we'll spend this week, next week, I don't know how long, with the long version. The short version is this: dinosaurs were created by God on day 6 of creation, the same day that man was created and all the other animals. And that was approximately 6,000 years ago. And they were all, like all of us, originally vegetarian. During the global flood, many of them were buried and fossilized, but 2 of each kind survived on Noah's Ark, with 2 of each kind of every other animal. Most dinosaurs eventually died out due to human activity, environmental changes, or other factors. Now, we're going to take a little bit deeper look at the story of these terrible lizards, and though I don't mean to insult anyone's intelligence, the lesson will be basic for the most part and more in depth, because I want to share it in such a way, the same way that Answers in Genesis shares the information, and Ken Ham, their founder, because if you share it as a full story, with all of the information, some of which we may know and some of which we may not, then it gives you the full story that you can share with people who may have never heard anything like it. Amen? All right. So let's start with the first question: did dinosaurs exist? Dinosaurs certainly roamed this earth in the ancient past. There are fossils of dinosaurs all over the world. Their bones are displayed in museums. We saw last year a quarry where they have turned the quarry into an exhibit of itself, because on a wall they've excavated into sort of a cave space where they have many dinosaurs in motion, right, as if what we would see, they were buried in the mud, right, but they have excavated just to the point you can see them in relief, and now they've used that as a display. Instead of excavating those bones out, it's like a wall of dinosaur bones. So there are many places in the world we can see dinosaurs fossilized, buried, and we can absolutely say without a doubt, at one point, that thing which we see as dead was living. And we know much about what they may have looked like based off of continued excavations. The story, though, of their discovery began in the 1820s. When Gideon Mantle, an English doctor, found some unusual teeth and a few bones in a quarry. Dr. Mantle realized there was something very different about the animal remains that he found, and he believed he'd found an entirely new group of reptiles. By 1841, about 9 types of these different reptiles had been uncovered, including 2 that they named Megalosaurus and Iguanodon. At this time, A famous British scientist named Dr. Richard Owen coined the name Dinosauria. So that was around the 1840s that the word came into existence, Dinosauria. And it meant terrible lizards. Because when he saw these huge bones, that's what it made him think of, terrible lizards or reptiles, and he created this name. Dinosaur simply means terrible lizard, but what dinosaurs are is kind of more than that, right? It's one group of several types of things, and we'll get into that more. But the huge size of some dinosaurs, in contrast to some other features, it really distinguishes dinosaurs from other reptiles, like crocodiles. Crocodiles we still have, and crocodiles are reptiles, but they are distinguished from what we call dinosaurs with several differences, like the position of their limbs. If you've ever seen a crocodile, or you've watched a crocodile waddle, because they don't really walk, right? They're kind of halfway between a serpent that slithers and other reptiles or mammals that walk with their limbs below their body, right? So most other reptiles have this sprawling position like crocodiles do, right? So they run like this with their limbs sprawled to the side. But most dinosaurs that we've excavated have limbs in a position beneath their body, whether they're 2 or 4, right? Their limbs are typically beneath their body. Crocodiles waddle, and dinosaurs, as far as we can tell, walked. So some dinosaurs were small, like the size of chickens or even smaller than that. Some of them were large, as tall as 40 feet high, or weighing as much as 80 tons. The average size of a dinosaur, though, of all the ones we know, the average size is about the size of a large sheep or a small bison. That's the average size of most of the dinosaurs we know. So when did dinosaurs live? The story that we've all heard from movies, television, newspapers, magazines, textbooks, right, is that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago. According to most evolutionists, dinosaurs ruled the earth over 140 million years ago, dying out about 65 million years ago, before man came on the scene, right? That's generally the story everyone has heard. However, scientists do not dig up anything labeled with those ages, right? They only uncover dead dinosaurs, like their bones. The bones only tell us that they died. They don't tell us when. And we talked about that in our geology study about isometric dating and different methods of trying to date things, and how that there is contextual bias, there is presumption bias, and that the science can be manipulated and has been manipulated. I'm sorry, radiometric, not isometric. Correction of that word, radiometric dating. So, the bones of the dinosaurs don't have labels attached to them telling how old they are. The Powerade that you have has a package date and a sell-by date, but bones that we dig up don't have a buried-by date, right? There's no way to look at them and know exactly when they were buried. Okay, the idea, though, of millions of years of evolution is just an evolutionist's story about the past. We've talked about this several times. No scientist was there to see the dinosaurs live through the supposed dinosaur ages, right? In fact, there's no proof whatsoever that the world and its fossil layers are millions of years old. We've talked about that a lot, especially in Unit 3. Unit 4. No scientist observed dinosaurs die off. So everything is speculation. Scientists only find bones in the here and now, and because most of them are evolutionists who find those bones, they try to fit what they see in the here and now with their story, with their worldview, right? And that we've talked about worldviews quite a bit, and how differing worldviews with differing presumptions look at the same evidence and interpret it differently, right? Other scientists, called creation scientists, have a different idea about when dinosaurs lived. They believe that they can solve any of the supposed dinosaur mysteries and show how the evidence fits wonderfully with their ideas of the past, which are the beliefs that come from the truth claims of God's Word. Although the Bible does not tell us exactly how long ago it was that God made the world and all of the creatures in it, we can get a good estimate of the date of creation by reading through the Bible and noting interesting passages, right? God made everything in 6 days, according to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. He did this to set a pattern for mankind. And that became our 7-day work week. And that was described in Exodus chapter 20. God worked for 6 days and rested for 1 day as a model for us. Not because he needed that time, but he wanted to show us the model that he had created for us. Furthermore, Bible scholars will tell you that the Hebrew word for day, and we've studied this, used in Genesis 1, can only mean an ordinary 24-hour day in this context. We covered that a few weeks ago. We read in the book of Genesis that God created the first man and the first woman, Adam and Eve. And he created them on day 6 of creation before he finished his creation. Many facts about when their children and their children's children were born are given throughout Genesis. And charts like this and charts like this are meant to follow those dates as Scripture gives them to us, to be able to tell exactly when we can count backward with those genealogies, exactly when time would have started. So we can estimate, because there might be some gaps, right? God might not have told us every single thing about every single person. But we can get a lot closer than completely guessing. Those chronologies of the Bible, it's impossible. One thing, we may be off by 500 years, maybe 1,000 years, but I guarantee you the Bible's chronologies cannot account for millions of years. It's impossible. As you add up all of those dates, and then you accept that Jesus Christ, according to both biblical and extra-biblical history, lived about 2,000 years ago, then that would make the earth, according to the Bible, when creation of the earth and the animals and man and dinosaurs occurred about 6,000 years ago, not millions of years ago. So the Bible is right. If the Bible's right, and it is, I believe it is, we should believe it is, dinosaurs must have lived in the past several thousand years, not in the past hundreds of millions of years. Okay, where did dinosaurs come from? Evolutionists will claim that dinosaurs evolved over millions of years. They imagine that one kind of an animal slowly, progressively becomes another kind of an animal over long periods of time. For instance, they believe that amphibians, those are animals that live in the water, changed into reptiles, including dinosaurs. And by this gradual process of natural selection and evolution. But that would mean, of course, that there would be millions of creatures in transition, what they refer to as transitional forms. There would have to be, over these eons of time, millions and millions of creatures that were 25%, 50%, 75%, right? Amphibian, and the rest reptile, moving toward another direction. Evidence of those transitional forms should be abundant. However, the fossil experts will tell you, in all kinds of fields, through all kinds of date ranges that you can look at, different works and interviews, documentaries, and published articles, peer-reviewed journals. There is no unquestionable transitional form found between any group of creature and another creature. None. They have identified some that they thought were transitional forms, and then they found out they were their own species. So they were not a transitional form from one thing, kind of thing, becoming another kind of thing. They were a kind of a thing on their own. If dinosaurs evolved from amphibians, there should be, for example, fossil evidence of animals that were partly one thing and partly another thing. And we jokingly looked at how things, different kinds could come about by cats and other, animals being blended together. But there's no proof anywhere of this transition, and that's why certain evolutionary teachers like Stephen Gould and Richard Dawkins have put forth ideas like punctuated equilibrium, where mutations that evolve one kind of thing to another kind of a thing occur by the building up of potential mutation energy until in one generation, one kind of a thing births another kind of a thing. So you never see a transitional form because it's potential until it's kinetic, right? And it's easy to put forth a theory like that as what we call a rescue device in logic. It's a convenient rescue device because you can't disprove it. You can't prove it either, but you can't disprove it, right? But again, it's a rescue device. It's trying to hold on to a worldview that has no substantiable evidence by creating evidence out of lack of evidence. Okay? So the Bible tells us that God created all of the land animals on the sixth day of creation. He had already created the water animals, he had already created the birds out of the water, right? And then he created the land animals on day 6. They must have been made right alongside Adam and Eve, and Adam must have named them, because that's what the Bible says in Genesis chapter 1. If God designed and created dinosaurs, then they would have been fully functional, designed to do what they were created for, and would have been 100% dinosaur immediately. Just like Adam was fully formed as an adult immediately. He didn't grow from a molecule to a man. He was made as a man. Evolutionists declare that no one ever lived along dinosaurs, but the Bible makes it plain that dinosaurs and people must have lived together. And we'll soon see, maybe next week, that there's a lot of evidence for this. So then, what did dinosaurs eat? I mentioned at the beginning in the short story that everything was a vegetarian, right? When God created us in Genesis chapter 1, man and animal were given the fruit of the trees, the herbs of the field, right? We were given fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds, and that was what we were supposed to eat. There was no death in God's original plan, so there was no eating of meat. There was no killing another thing to feed yourself by the animals or by man. That wasn't a part of the original plan, because death, I don't know if you understand this, but death was never supposed to exist. In the original Garden of Eden, it wasn't that men would live a long time. No one and nothing was ever meant to die. Everything was made to be eternal. And it was only by man's sin that death entered into the world. And you can see that in Romans chapter 5. If you have your Bible, turn to Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Romans 5:12. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, Adam's choices brought sin into the world. Sin did not exist in the world. It did in the heart of Lucifer, but he wasn't in the world. But sin entered into the world that God had created by Adam's sin, and death by sin. So Adam, by falling to the temptation of Satan, brought sin into God's creation. And his sin brought death into God's creation, because death is the wages of sin, right? It is the equal earned consequence of sin. And death by sin. And so death, because of Adam, passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. His sin is now passed from him through his bloodline forever, until God stops that in eternity, right? So that means every son born of man, every daughter born of man, is born with that sin nature, with the curse of death, because of Adam. And that's why Christ was not born of man. He was born of spirit and of woman. And the sin nature was not passed upon him. The temptation was because he was in the flesh. But the sin nature was not passed to him, because he was not born of the bloodline of Adam by a man. Okay, so that's Romans 5:12. Everybody was a vegetarian in Genesis chapter 1. Death came onto the scene by the killing of the first ram, right, to clothe Adam and Eve after they sinned. And then death has reigned since then. Sadly, that didn't last very long, the rebellion and all of this that we just talked about. But there was no death of animals or humans before Adam sinned, and that refutes all of the theological evolution, day-age theory, gap theory, all of the attempts to blend creationism with evolutionism, because evolution depends on the champion of death. Evolution cannot be true unless death is the victor. Death is what brings about evolution. Something has to die for something else to live, and if things don't die, then you don't have the natural selection of the best, the biggest, the strongest, the most adapted to carry on and continue evolution. But the champion of evolution is death. The champion of creation is God. And he conquered death. He did not use death. Death was a consequence of our rebellion. But you can see that in Romans 5:12, Genesis 2:17, Genesis 1:29-30, Romans chapter 8, 20 through 22, Acts 3:21, Hebrews 9:22, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, almost all of it, Revelation 21, 1 through 4, and Revelation 22, 3. That means that there could not have been animal fossils or dinosaur bones before sin, because nothing died before sin. That means the dinosaurs had to have lived with Adam and Eve, at least, right? Okay, we got that. And then after Adam's sin, animals and people started to die. It was a different world, one with death and strife. Man had to work by the sweat of his brow, and animals and people were going to die. A world that was once beautiful now suffered under the curse placed upon it by our Creator, because he gave the command and we rebelled. Okay. A promise was also given in Genesis 3:15 that God would provide a way for that penalty of sin to be paid, so that there would be a way for man to come back to God. That prophecy, that's the earliest prophecy of Jesus Christ, Genesis chapter 3, right at the very beginning. But we see that dinosaurs ate vegetables just like we did, and fruit and grass, right, and nuts and seeds just like we did. But then, of course, that changed. Okay, so there is with all of the creatures we've seen in this class, there is what they were originally created to do, which we may never know, and there's what they are now doing under the curse of sin, right? I don't believe that snakes were meant to be venomous, to bite, to attack, to kill. I don't think that that was what their original intended purpose was. I think that is that is now in their nature because of sin, right? And there are very interesting studies done on snake venom that use electricity to straighten out the proteins that make up the neurotoxins in their venom, that when they, through electricity, unbind those neurotoxins, the amino acid strains and the protein bands that make up those neurotoxins are actually beneficial to humans. And that's a striking concept, to think that maybe snake venom was useful before sin corrupted it, right? But again, there's many, many stories like that about different things that God's original creation probably wasn't as, I would say definitely wasn't, as aggressive toward man as it is now. But it groans under the weight of our sin. But why do we find dinosaur fossils? We said there weren't any fossils when Adam was alive because nothing had died. But we find dinosaur fossils. So in Genesis 6:12, we read that all flesh, that's man and animals, had corrupted his way upon the earth. Perhaps people and animals were killing each other at that point. God commanded them to build a great ship, the ark. He commanded Noah to do this and his family, so that all the kinds of land animals, which must have included dinosaurs, And Noah's family could survive on board that ark while the flood destroyed the entire earth as the just punishment for the sin of man. And we read that through Genesis chapter 6. Some people like to think that the dinosaurs were too big, or that there were too many of them to go on the ark. And they make fun of the truth claim of Noah's Ark with little children's books of dinghy-sized boats with a bunch of animal heads sticking out of it, right? And that is preposterous, because if you looked at the measurements that the Bible gives for the ship that he had Noah build, and you think about the fact that we can't tell you how long a cubit was for men who lived before the flood. With different conditions, they could have been far bigger people. We have fossilized records of plants that exist today that are 12 to 15 times larger in the fossil record before the flood than they can ever get to today. If man even had half that potential, let's say man was only twice the size before the flood that he is now, and there is evidence around the world of 14-foot long human skeletons buried and preserved, right? If man could be 14 feet tall, his cubit is a lot longer than 18 inches, right? So that ship, even if it was our modern cubit, if you've seen the Ark Encounter in Kentucky that the Creation Science Museum has put together, they built a 1-to-1 scale of the Ark. It's massive. And then the second factor is the boat was far bigger than the little dinghy that they put in the children's books, but also the animals weren't as big. God wouldn't have chosen fully adult, past their prime animals to go on the ark to regenerate the world. He would have chosen young adults that are near or at breeding age, but that are also small enough that they can all fit, and they don't eat as much, right? For the 120 days they're going to be on the ark, 150 days they're going to be on the ark, right? And there's less food to have to feed them. So these concepts that make absolute sense, God, who is a reasonable God, would have done reasonable things. And then it is not unreasonable to believe the ark could have carried 2, and in some cases 7, of every kind of animal. And we read that throughout Genesis chapter 7. But there were no exceptions. There's a funny Scottish song about why we don't see unicorns anymore, because they were playing and splashing in the water, and they didn't come to the ark when God called them. And so then the unicorns died in the flood. It doesn't make any sense. If you actually want to know, the term unicorn was used to describe rhinoceros, the creature of a rhinoceros with the horn. There are both one-horn and two-horn rhinoceri, and the unicorn term in the 1600s, 1700s English meant the one-horned rhinoceros. Okay? So it didn't mean a horse with a horn growing out of the top of its head that had some kind of magical powers. It's a fun song, but nothing was left out. God called all animals, either by 2s or by 7s, depending on if they were needed for food and sacrifice. And they all went to the ark. Dinosaurs must have been on the ark. And even though there was ample room in this huge ship for large animals, like I said, God probably sent young adults on the ark that still had plenty of room to grow. Then the kinds is another discussion. There may be hundreds of names for dinosaurs, but there are less than 50 kinds of dinosaurs, right? It's like we have hundreds of breeds of dogs today, but they could have easily came from just 2 dogs. With the genetic potential that God designed into man, 2 people, Adam and Eve, can produce all of the ways that we all look over time, because God designed such infinite genetic potential. And the way that it adds and multiplies and genetics spread, and they adapt to the environment and to what you eat and to what you do and don't do. So that adaptation is also in animal species. So there were 2 dogs of the dog kind, 2 cats of the cat kind, right? So then dinosaurs, plesiosaurs, pterodons, right? There are different kinds of dinosaurs, and then there are just lots and lots of variations within those kinds. Okay? So then again, it doesn't have to be hundreds of different dinosaurs. It could be like fewer than 50 kinds, max 100 total dinosaurs, if there even needed to be that many. And what happened to all the land animals that did not go onto the ark? Very simply, they drowned, like all the people who didn't go on the ark. Many would have been covered with tons of mud as the rampaging rain and water covered the land. We see that from Genesis chapter 7, verses 11 through 19. And because of the quick burial, many of those animals that were caught off guard would have been preserved as fossils. We talked about that in Unit 4 when we looked down at why are some things fossilized and other things are not. Because it has to be quickly encased in mud to keep the oxygen from being able to decay it. Right? So if it's stopped before decay, then it can either be fossilized or petrified. Right? There's mineralization and petrification, and we talked about all of that in Unit 4. But once they're preserved, if we believed, as we do, that the worldwide global flood with massive tons of mud covered lots and lots of creatures on a world that was a lot more land than it was water, right? If all of that happened, what we would expect to see is millions or billions of dead things buried in rock layers formed from that mud all over the earth. And that's exactly what we find. Billions of dead things fossilized in rock layers all over the world. Okay. The Noah's flood, that flood of his day, probably occurred just over 4,500 years ago. Creationists believe that this event formed many of the fossil layers that we see around the earth, but there are additional fossil layers on top of that that were formed by other floods and other natural disasters that happened as Earth was trying to reach an equilibrium, right? It didn't just all go away. There could have been localized floods or mudslides or volcanoes or earthquakes as the Earth was trying to reach an equilibrium. And we know that it still hasn't really reached an equilibrium because we still have tectonic activity. We still have plates, we still have tsunamis, we still have hurricanes, we still have tropical storms, we still have violent volcanic explosions, right? Because the Earth has still not reached an equilibrium from those effects. If the Earth were actually millions or billions of years old, there's no reason that we wouldn't be at an equilibrium by now from a single massive event. It would have to have been several like extinction level events, which is what a lot of scientists try to throw in. But again, they're not finding evidence to back that up. It's all hearsay. So the dinosaur fossils, which were formed as a result of the flood, were formed about 4,500 years ago, not millions of years ago. And there could be other layers, but we can definitely easily interpret them within the truth claims of the Bible. We do not need science, falsely so-called, from the belief system of